to the People's Forum. For those of you who have not been here before, we are an educational and cultural space. We call it a movement incubator for working class communities and marginalized communities. Very happy to host this event here. So thank you all for coming. I wanted to actually start with framing. We all know why Manning and Julian are now being indicted and targeted, right? If you all saw that terrible video of the U.S. Military targeting civilians in Iraq, right? This is the kind of video that the U.S. government does not want, the public to see, right? And this is why we are in the predicament that we are. Here at the People's Forum, we are unapologetically anti-imperialist, and we understand the importance to talk about Julian's cases, about Chelsea's cases, about the importance that whistleblowers have had, and the impact that they have had in this country, and also about what this terrible precedent that it says. In terms of Chelsea and Julian, many journalists believe that this could set a terrible precedent in terms of prosecuting journalists. But it also sets a precedent to attack anyone who can dare release information or do any work that damages the government and their interest. And that's why we at the People's Forum understand that we need to pay attention to these cases. And as organizers, we need to be aware of what's happening. And this is also why we're not only today talking about Julian and Chelsea, but also about Ola Bini, who is a web developer, not a whistleblower, who got caught at the crossfire of these cases, and was just, someone who was arrested just because, under no charges, and someone who, they thought just because he works with computers, he's a techie, he must be working in conspiracy with Julian Assange, right? So we understand that this sets a terrible precedent. So we are not only here to understand these cases and to understand the repercussions, but to also understand how can we take action. So here with me are John Kiriakou via Zoom. Thank you for joining us, John. John is a former CIA officer, senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In 2007, Kiriakou blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program. He released the information that the CIA tortured prisoners, that it was official U.S. government policy, and that it had been approved by George W. Bush. He became the sixth whistleblower indicted by the Obama administration under the Espionage Act, and he served 23 months in prison as a result of that revelation. And we have with us Abby Hassan. Thank you for joining us, Abby. Abby is a criminal defense attorney and technologist, co-founder of the Black Movement Law Project. He was formerly the mass defense coordinator in the National Lawyers Guild, and a union and community organizer. So Abby has both a law degree and a degree in computer science. And we have here Idalene Bobet. Idalene is the founder of techactivist.org, which is a grassroots organization providing free technical training and political education workshops to working class youth, activists, and disruptors interested in using technology for social good. So we actually wanted to get started with John, because John is in the UK and he's nice enough to be here with us, even though it's very late in the UK. So John, we wanted to get started with you. You yourself are a whistleblower. Can you frame for us the targeting of Chelsea Manning, the attacks on whistleblower under the Obama administration, and how it is under the Trump administration, and also the impact that whistleblowers have had here in the United States?
All good questions and all important questions. You know, you thought that things actually couldn't get worse than they were under Barack Obama, and they got a lot worse. Between the passage of the Espionage Act in 1917 and the inauguration of Barack Obama, 3 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. Just in the 8 years of the Obama presidency, 8 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. And keep in mind that in many cases, espionage can carry with it the death penalty. So this is really the gravest charge with which an American can be charged. Realistically, if you're charged with espionage, you run the very serious risk of spending the rest of your life in prison. There's almost nothing that you can do to protect yourself. It's something that you have to weigh when you make that decision of whether or not you're going to blow the whistle on waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality. Chelsea Manning did just that. Chelsea Manning blew the whistle on waste, fraud, abuse, and illegality. Now, the important thing there is we actually have a law in this country that makes it illegal to classify something that's a crime. If something is illegal, you're not allowed to make it a classified program. If it is something that embarrasses the government or embarrasses the CIA, you're not allowed to make it a classified program. And so if you have a military unit murdering Iraqi civilians, you can't classify that. And if it's not legally classified, then you can't charge the whistleblower. So what do? They come up with other reasons to charge you. I've detected a very troubling pattern over the last year or so, and that is arresting a national security whistleblower and not charging him or her with espionage at first. You're charging him or her with a sex crime, whether it's rape, as in the case of Julian Assange, or it's child pornography in the case of Matthew DeHart. Now, there was never any child pornography, and the charges were thrown out, but not before Matthew DeHart's reputation was ruined. So let's look at the case of Chelsea Manning. Chelsea released more than 100,000 pages of documents to WikiLeaks. Those documents included countless crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity. They should not have been classified. It might be they were not properly classified. But she was prosecuted anyway, not in a civilian court where it could have been challenged, but they prosecuted her in a military court where she had very, very few rights and almost no liberties. So why is Chelsea just out of jail again? And why is she looking at going to jail again, yet again, not for the 3rd time? Not for espionage, not for leaking, but because she won't rat out Julian Assange. And she won't testify against him in a grand jury. Now, this is a pattern. This is something that our government likes to do. If they can't get you in the charge that they want to get you on, they'll trump up a charge. They'll make up a charge. That's number 1. Number 2, they do something called venue shopping, where they will charge you in the federal district where you are the most likely to be indicted and the most likely to receive a severe sentence. So let's say that whatever it is that you did in Timbuktu, they're not going to charge you in Timbuktu. They're going to charge you in Alexandria, Virginia. That's the espionage court, where no national security defendant has ever been acquitted of a crime. You are guaranteed to go to prison if you're charged in the Eastern District of Virginia. I was charged there. Jeffrey Sterling, the CIA whistleblower, was charged there. Julian has been charged there. Ed Snowden has been charged there because they know that they can't lose. And finally, the third thing that they do, and this is something that we saw in spades with Chelsea Manning, and that's called charge stacking. What they do is, instead of charging you with a crime, they'll charge you with 5 and 20 felonies. And they wait until you go bankrupt. And then they come back to you and they say, all right, if you take a plea for one charge, we'll dismiss all the other charges. Well, what are you going to do? You're risking the notion of dying in prison. So do you just take the deal and make this thing go away? Of course you do. ProPublica came out with a study in November of 2012 that found that the federal government wins 98.2% of its cases. Now, when I was at the CIA and Saddam Hussein used to win 98% when he would run for re-election, we would laugh and we would say that the fix was in, it was all fixed. But the Justice Department wins 98% of its cases, we say they're geniuses. Well, I'm telling you the fix is in. And so this is something that whistleblowers think everywhere. This is something that Chelsea Manning is facing right now as we're speaking. She's already been convicted and incarcerated for espionage-related crimes, even though she did not commit, even though she did not come to the aid of any foreign country. She simply exposed waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, and threats to the public health and public safety, which is the legal definition of whistleblowing. But she got a commutation, and my God, that made the Pentagon angry. They came after her again, and they put her in jail for another 62 days, and now they're going to come after her again this week, and they're going to send her back to jail. So this is something that we all have to watch. It's something that we all have to fight. I know I'm not really supposed to talk about Julian. There are other people that are going to talk about Julian, but I am going to say that we've learned lessons from these other cases, mine included, Chelsea's especially. And that is that the playing field is not level. We have to fight with everything that we have. And what we have, I believe, is the possibility of jury nullification. I think that we need to take to the media as best we can. We need to take to the streets as best we can. And we need to convince anybody who might possibly be on a jury that is going to sit in front of Julian Assange. And we need to explain to them that you can oppose an unjust law.
Mm-hmm.
The law shouldn't be did he do it or did he not do it. The law should be why did he do it if he did it. Was it in the public service? In the case of Julian Assange, in the case of Chelsea Manning and others, it was in the public service. And jail is the last place those people belong. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, John. I was wondering if also you could talk a little bit about what inspired you to become a whistleblower, and the importance of whistleblowers, in American history, of having people like you, like Chelsea.
Thank you. What inspired me to become a whistleblower, there's an Israeli journalist by the name of Eyal Press who did a psychological study of whistleblowers all through modern history, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And he found that there was one consistent theme among all whistleblowers, whether they were in national security or in banking or pharmaceuticals or whatever. And that is that whistleblowers have an unusually clearly defined sense of right and wrong. That in the mind of a whistleblower, most issues are black and white. That there is a right and a wrong. There's not a gray area.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the torture program was quite simply wrong. It was morally wrong. It was ethically wrong. And I believe strongly then and now that it was illegal. And so that's why I elected to blow the whistle on it. The cost has been very, very high. I lost my job. I lost my security clearance. I'll probably never work in either government or corporate of America ever again. I lost my house. I lost my wife. I lost my pension. But there are some issues that are bigger than us as individuals. Mm-hmm. This is something that my attorneys told me early on. That my case was way, way bigger than John Kuriakis. This was a case about the country. This was a case about who we are as Americans and who we want to be as Americans. You know, we tell every other country that we are these shining people of respect for human rights and civil liberties, and that's just simply not true. We're hypocrites. And so we have to decide as a country who we want to be. If we want to be that so-called shining city on a hill, then that's what we should be. But if we're going to torture people, if we're going to hide them in secret prison, if we're going to kidnap them and send them to other countries to be tortured, then let's be honest with our own people. And so when nobody else came forward, I decided that the issue was important enough that I would do it myself, and I did. And I'm glad I did. It was worth it.
Wow, thank you, and thank you for your bravery in taking that action and blowing the whistle.
No, thank you.
We wanted to open it up for questions for John, since given he's very late in the UK. So, is there anyone have any questions, comments?
I have a question. So, I think that, as you mentioned in your presentation, that through the history of the United States up until 2008, only was it 3 whistleblowers had been charged with espionage.
3.
And were you aware of who they were, and their kind of lasting legacy? Daniel Ellsberg comes to mind, and they're very well. There's probably others, but I mean, I think that if we're thinking about whistleblowers and high-level top security leakers in American history, Ellsberg comes to mind as someone who I think must serve as a model to someone like you. Do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, Daniel Ellsberg is very clearly and simply my personal hero. I was 6 years old when Dan leaked the Pentagon Papers. And I actually remember it. That might sound funny to you. You know, why would a 6-year-old be aware of the Pentagon Papers? But my parents were very cognizant of current events, and we had dinner as a family every single night, 7 nights a week. And even though we were little kids, my parents always talked about what was happening in the news, whether it was the war in Vietnam, the bombing of Cambodia. I remember when Martin Luther King was killed, and Bobby Kennedy was killed. I was just a little kid, but these were topics of conversation in our house. And I remember my father very deliberately and slowly and in language that a little kid could understand explained to me why Daniel Ellsberg was a true American hero and President Nixon was not. Because Dan Ellsberg cared about what the law said. Dan Ellsberg cared about making sure that Americans were safe. But more importantly, Dan Ellsberg cared about making sure that the country was what the country professed to be. If we are going to be American exceptionalism, and a lot of people are, then we really do have to be exceptional. Not in the way that the neoliberal Democrats and the neoconservative Republicans would have, but in a way where we are true to the Constitution and true to the respect for civil rights and civil liberties and human rights that the Founding Fathers wanted us to be. And so, yes, Dan Ellsberg is absolutely the role model, not just for me, but for every other national security whistleblower. I was talking to Ed Snowden just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the first things out of his mouth was how much he loves and respects Dan Ellsberg. I mean, Dan is a giant in this community, and history is going to smile. I think it already has.
Any other comments or questions? No? Okay, so John, you're welcome to stay if you want to continue, but we understand if you absolutely have to leave us because you've had such a long day.
It's been a long day. I've been up for 32 hours.
Oh, no. You sound so coherent for being up for 32 hours.
Oh. Thank you. I can barely keep my eyes open. I'm trying.
Thank you so much for making the effort
Thank you.
being with us and sharing.
Oh, no. Very, very best of luck.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so now I would like to talk about Julian's case, Abby, and I'd like for you to frame Julian's case for us.
Yeah, and let me just pick up a little bit where John just left off in terms of Ellsberg and kind of the dynamic that his was. I mean, is everyone familiar with the Pentagon Papers and what the content of that was?
I think you should add to it. A lot of people may not know.
Yeah, so I mean, the Pentagon Papers literally were an accurate history of the Vietnam War, right? So it was an internal military contracted attempt to actually understand what went wrong with the Vietnam War. And one of the reasons that I think Ellsberg was so compelled to release this was that it was in diametrical opposition to what the government had been saying was going on and were there reasons for engaging. And mind you, the Vietnam War killed, probably 3 million people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Truly a genocidal operation, right? Like targeting of villagers, directly targeting dams. It was a truly brutal and horrific 10, 11-year-long war, right? And so Ellsberg was moved. He was served in the war, and then he got to very high levels within intelligence. He actually was working for the RAND Corporation, which is still in existence, a high-level national security contractor. So, but what's important to understand also is that what that led to, combined with Watergate, combined with the Media Pennsylvania break-in that exposed COINTELPRO and other domestic operations, was actually the only real attempt that as a society we've ever had at reining in the national security state and reining in the power of our secret police and our military operations, which was, there was various processes. One was the impeachment of Nixon, but most importantly, I think, is the Church Committee, named after the Senator Frank Church, who was the head of that committee. There was a House committee and a Senate committee that were special committees. This is something that Congress can do that is loath to do, but doesn't happen too often. But basically, who watches the Watchers Committee, a committee that heavily staffed with kind of like the Mueller Committee, but if the Mueller Committee was investigating the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the Pentagon, right? So imagine that happening today. We're far from it, but the point is that's what those leaking and whistleblowing acts led to in terms of structural reform and, frankly, historical documentation of the actual machinations of power within the most secretive organizations and institutions of our society. So I think that's important to understand, like, this is why you do this, because you do it for history, you do it to create change, you do it because it's the right thing to do. And honestly, it's interesting to hear John, I wish John was still here, but obviously to hear his perspective, because I'm a lawyer, and I really take a much more kind of political economic view of a lot of the things that go on, whereas he was on the other side as a defendant, and he's thinking about the law and the majesty of the rule of law. And so it's interesting contrast, because I'm like the rule of law, that none of these people believe in that. But like, I honestly, as a practicing attorney, I do find that like people want to believe that the Constitution exists and that their rights exist and that these things, and I'm the cynical, jaded lawyer. So it's helpful to hear that kind of aspiration and that kind of view of our constitutional system. But so picking up on something he said, just the backdrop of this also is that it's not just whistleblowers that have a 98% chance of winning, right? So I think he said 98% of, it's a very, very low, they don't actually keep these statistics. So if ProPublica did that research, I would trust it. But behind that 98% of cases that they win is the fact that 97% of cases never go to trial, right? In the federal system, trials are a true rarity. And that is worth understanding as how this system developed, right? Because 100 years ago, everything went to trial, right? Virtually. The idea that you would make a deal would be considered a form of corruption, right? Of course you can't make a deal. You have to, it's about finding out the truth, right? It's no longer the case. So those dynamics in terms of stacking charges so that you face 100 years to take a deal for 5, as if 5 years, I was furious when everyone was like, Paul Manafort got off easy. I'm sorry, if you're 70 years old and you go to prison for 5 years, that's a life sentence almost. Like, I don't give a F about Paul Manafort, but the point is we've been so inured with these insane, just cruel, vicious sentencing that we think sentencing a 70-year-old person to 5 years in prison is a slap on the wrist. It's not. But that's the backdrop, and that's why, and frankly, I don't think it's enough to just look at it from that espionage perspective. It is the war on drugs and the assault on black and brown communities that has built up this status quo and that has built up this as a regular practice. No other country does this, right? So that's an important backdrop to understand like how we're here. So if we're looking at Assange, again, like Assange is at this point is nobody's hero. He's made enough enemies on, for political purposes in this country, right? The Democrats hate him because they think that he, that he made the Hillary Clinton's people say a bunch of bad shit on email and then leak it, right? So the Democrats hate him. The Republicans hate anyone who is against the national security establishment, right? And that's decidedly his prerogative. So he has no friends. And so in some sense, he is the perfect target to ratchet up the laws and to make new precedent, right? Because I wish I could be as optimistic as John Kiriakou was about jury nullification for Julian Assange, but I promise you that that they're going hard on him because they know that he doesn't have friends, and they know that he is a perfect, in the world of civil rights law, or in the world of the ACLU or what in the legal, if you're familiar with the term impact litigation, you need to pick your clients, right? You don't want to pick a client to make a breakthrough case that is unsympathetic, right? You want a sympathetic client because judges are human and they make a lot of decisions based on their personal, a colleague of mine just did a case where someone was, doesn't matter the details. The point is they charged him with the wrong crime, but he was a murderer and he was like a vicious, he tortured people and murdered them, right? But the law, what they did, they charged him with the wrong crime. According to the law, they should reverse that conviction. But they're never going to do it because this guy's terrible. No one wants to say you're the judge that let the torturer go, right? So Julian Assange is that the opposite of, it's what you wouldn't want as a impact litigation, but it's perfect for them because they know that he's made enough enemies that he's not going to get a broad-based political support for his case, right? And so what he's charged with is a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that is known as the CFAA, and it's a truly terrible law. I mean, it's a law that it was created just what I've read. Several sources have said that basically Ronald Reagan watched the movie War Games. Have you seen this with Matthew Broderick? It's kind of like
1983.
Yeah, it was like a hacker film, like an early days hacker film, and Ronald Reagan was not the brightest bulb, and he was like, we need to do something about this, so they made this completely insane law, right? That really should have been updated or revised or revoked because it basically is so vague. It basically says the heart of the law is unauthorized access on a protected computer. And none of those terms are defined in terms of unauthorized or protected, right? So, and what happens, in the legal system, when a law is vague, it means that the political prerogatives of the institutions charged with enforcing it get to make not just headlines, but careers. Literally, individuals get to make careers out of it. And, you know, John Kiriakou mentioned the Eastern District of Virginia, right? So that is where you make a career as a prosecutor in the national security establishment, right? So you want to start your career, you rack up some wins, then you get a job at the NSA or the CIA or one of these institutions. You know, it's a revolving door. There is a very real political economy to prosecutions, right? And it involves these government contracting and national security establishment jobs. So that's, and the same thing happens here, right? Like, you know, Rudy Giuliani, Preet Bharara, all these guys who've been in charge of the Southern District of New York, they make very, you know, they're very ambitious, politically oriented people. It's not like they do those jobs, they prosecute some people and then fade into. Chris Christie, very famously, people mostly know him now for a prosecution of Jared Kushner's father, but he's also responsible for the Fort Dix 5, if you're familiar with, like a very kind of manufactured anti-terrorism case where they just like railroaded some guys because they made it was like, you know, post 9/11 kind of fever case, but really disgusting case. You know, I think he did the Shack 7 animal rights activist charges terrorists. Like, so, you know, literally people who like are like trying to like let puppies go from like animal testing facilities charged as terrorists, right? Wow. Like, so, but that's how these guys operate, and so, you know, Chris Christie, if you think of like one of, you know, just deplorable person, but he made his career in, you know, the New Jersey U.S. Attorney's Office. So there is a political economy to this that is important to kind of take note of, and that's not to say that everyone, you know, not everyone is one of these ambitious, you know, there are people like John Kiriakou who are like true believers in the Constitution and do things the right way, but you might not that's not how you're going to necessarily rack up the most political clout, right? So that's where Assange is. That's what he's charged with. I think that he's largely an unsympathetic defendant, and you know, the case is very shaky. If everyone, you know, another paradigmatic CFAA case is Aaron Swartz. Are you guys familiar with him? So Aaron Swartz was a really kind of luminary internet creator and activist, and just, you know, kind of like the Renaissance man of the internet in a lot of ways. You know, he was partially responsible for founding Reddit. I think he founded Boing Boing. He was man, I don't know if it's Boing Boing, but he was a real kind of internet pioneer and really interested in like freeing information in the most kind of humanitarian sense, right? And so one of the things that got him he got on the radar of the U.S. attorneys in Massachusetts was, so I don't know if you're familiar, anyone heard of PACER? PACER? It's an acronym. It's the system that stores all the legal papers that are filed in federal court, right? So the transcripts for trials, all the motions, all that stuff. So a court is supposed to be a public forum, right? You're supposed to have a trial in public. And so all of the papers that are filed, unless there's a specific reason to make it private, like if it has, you know, if it has very private information or could embarrass or hurt someone, right? You can file things secretly, but almost everything else is public. And the transcripts, you know, have you heard the term open court? In open court, open court means theoretically that the public has access. Before the internet, if you wanted to get this public access, you could go to the courthouse and look through it. If you wanted to order it, you had to pay 10 cents a page to look through it. Now, once the advent of the internet came, they didn't say, oh, wait a minute, we're not paying for copies anymore. We can give this information out freely. They said, we're going to still charge 10 cents a page, and we're going to use that money to fund the courts, right? So that's what they do. So you still have to pay 10 cents a page to get public documents from the court website. It's called PACERS, is the system they created. Those things have no copyright, right? Those are public documents. So what Aaron Swartz did was create a system that that you could install an internet browser plugin and that when you download something, it would upload it automatically to a public database, so that theoretically it would only have to be downloaded once. This put him on the watch list of the FBI and U.S. attorneys, it seems, right? And I mean, honestly, they still hate it. I use Pacer every day, but the court has told all the lawyers that they're not allowed to use that system that Aaron Swartz created, that they have to pay. Everyone has to pay individually, right? So what he got charged with was that people in elite institutions, like he was doing something in affiliation with MIT. They had given him access to their system. I mean, to their campus, right? And JSTOR, do you know JSTOR? JSTOR is the kind of main repository for academic publishing, right? For researching and looking at academic publishing. And he basically used his MIT access to download a ton of articles. And people, they said that they thought that he was probably going to upload them. And he had spoken about this, I think, several times, about the idea that why is it that the elite in America have access to the world's academic production, but institutions in the third world, in the global south, can't afford that access. And it's all online, it's all there. It's not like the authors of those academic papers wanted to maintain a firewall and keep it from people, but, and so a prosecutor, this was early in the days where they're just hungry to kind of get hackers. And I think that it was one of those things where, again, back to the political economy, I think that you could make a career for yourself as the prosecutor that caught some hackers, right? And so they charged him with the computer fraud and recess because he was violating JSTOR's terms of service by downloading too many articles at one time. And he had, because he had taken a laptop, they said, and brought it into a closet and plugged it directly into the network so that he could, and he had done something to re-log in every once in a while. He had done something that was because they would shut you off after a certain amount of time. So, so he was downloading too many articles at once, right? That was what he actually did. They say that they thought he might be wanting to release them, but he had not released them. So that was enough for them to charge him, and he would be facing decades in prison for this. So, and they offered him a deal. They were going to offer him a deal for less time, but he didn't want to set that precedent. And I think that the whole thing, he ended up killing himself in the midst of this prosecution.
And it was still 10 years, which wasn't a little bit of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, a little bit of time in this context is 5 years, right? That's what Julian Assange is facing, right? So that's kind of, that's the CFAA, right? That's kind of the clearest cut, just creepy injustice of the law. It's incredibly vague, it's incredibly broad, and specifically if you look at the indictment against Julian Assange, it specifically enumerates a lot of things that are nowhere close and should not be an indictment for criminality, right? Because it's talking about, he put a Linux on a CD, right? There's something else in there that he used an encrypted chat, right? And this is honestly, it's creepy, but this stuff happens all the time. They cast typical privacy activity as if it is, nefarious activity all the time, right? And so there's also a very strange thing with the Assange case where they're using a kind of terror. They're talking about terrorism. I didn't see it in the thing yet, but I read another article analyzing the case where they're trying to justify going past. It has a 5-year statute of limitations, going past the statute of limitations because it involves terrorism somehow. And he's been called a terrorist. I think Joe Biden called him a terrorist, right? Joe Biden said something pretty terrible about WikiLeaks. I think Mike Pompeo called WikiLeaks a adverse foreign intelligence service or something. There's a very you know, there's a very explicit, you know, as John Kiriakou said, you know, starting in the Obama administration, this real bad turn of turning journalistic activities into terrorism or into espionage, and this is kind of like just one ratcheting of that, but by Trump, who has, you know, it's not. It used to be kind of a law school hypothetical to say, what if a crazy president who wanted to destroy the free press got a hold of these laws that the good president like Obama was using in specific cases, right? So that what if, we're living the what if, right? Like Trump is out there saying, you know, Assange is doing stuff, and so is the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? And, you know, so we're really, you know, this is something that, like, I think that we have to really pay attention to and really kind of be up in arms about, and, you know, that, you know, I remember reading probably 10 years ago, in the midst of John Kiriakou's case, Edward Snowden, all these cases, Jane Mayer, kind of preeminent investigative journalist for The New Yorker, saying that investigative journalism is dead because of the chilling effect that these prosecutions have on journalists. They're terrified of actually having sources. They're terrified of getting to, of acquiring information, because everything's classified, everything's overclassified. You have these people, you know, from the U.S. attorneys to the Mike Pompeo to the CIA, you know, to James Comey, who prior to his infamy for the, you know, not indicting Hillary Clinton in the most dramatic way possible, was going around saying that we need to end encryption, basically, that people should not be able to encrypt their own communication. So it's a you know, and the last thing I'll add into this dynamic that I think is very important to understand is the global dynamic, right? I see the Lula Libre sticker here, right? So the impact that the U.S., not just militarily, right? Like Lula is in prison because of a joint operation by the U.S. Department of Justice and Brazilian kind of and Brazilian and Central American institutions that are vaguely using the concept of corruption to attack political enemies, right? I mean, and it truly bothers me as a criminal defense attorney in this country, because we're literally exporting the failures of our system. Our system, because we put so many people in prison, our system has had to adjust, where people don't get trials anymore. We scare one person to testify against another person, which should be considered absurd, right? The idea that you could say, oh, you're gonna tell the truth because I'll let you go if you tell the truth about this other person. The idea that that is valid testimony, it's absurd, right? They don't do this in other countries until we start telling them to do it, right? So because our system has been so corrupted by our just insatiable desire to put poor black and brown people in prison, we're now exporting the system that we've created to adapt to that, to other countries. And it's like, it's shocking, it's horrifying. And the result in Brazil is literally a fascist has taken over. The leading presidential candidate was just completely falsely imprisoned, and a president was literally taken out of office for non-crimes. So, and this is happening, you know, Brazil is the most striking example, but I think if we look at what's happened in Ecuador, right, this case with Ola Bini is just, it's an example of that influence playing itself out through one person's case, right? So I'll turn it over to Idalene.
Thank you for framing that so perfectly.
Yes, I think a lot of what we're talking about is that knowledge is being seen as a crime, and there's a war on knowledge. I would say, as a person of color, a woman of color, Black Latina, you don't see many of us in tech. You don't see many of us even knowing or having access to this type of knowledge of being a criminal just because you have access to certain knowledge or technical tools. So it's interesting to, like, Ola's case is very interesting, and because Ola, yes, he's a very tall white man. So I think people of color, poor people, we wouldn't pay attention to Ola because Ola is a person of privilege. He's been having access to tech, to very high levels of education. Since he was 8 years old, he was coding. The media, if you just look at it, will paint him as a hacker. And even about a week before he was arrested in Ecuador, you have Ecuador's minister, Maria Paula Romo, said, there's Russian hackers in Ecuador who's part of WikiLeaks, and we're going to catch this person. Then Ola, April 11th, goes to the airport to go to Japan for a martial arts conference that he planned like months ago. He tweeted about it 2 months prior to actually going, his excitement, his part of his mental health, and just, like your techie, you're always like this, you want to go out and just relax, stretch. He gets detained. Ola has not committed a crime. Still today, Ola is innocent of everything, but he's being detained since April 12th. He doesn't speak Spanish. He wasn't given a translator. In the Ecuador prison, which actually was visiting him last week, he has no access to food. He is a vegetarian. They're not giving him vegetarian food. They have no access to water in this entire prison. So as someone who is visiting, you bring in a gallon of water, and they eat, drink. There's no showers there, so that you wash what you can, you brush your teeth. You do everything with this gallon of water. If you're not given that gallon of water, then you have no water. People are extremely sick in this prison. The prison cells are only supposed to have 2 people in the cells. They have about 6 to 8 people in every cell.
Oh my God.
There's only 1 mattress in every cell, if that. And there's, gang affiliation on who gets to sleep on the mattress. So Ola has been sleeping on a hard floor that's super humid. There's no lights in these cells. No lights at all. They only get access to get out 1 hour a day.
Wow.
And they have visitation from friends, family, for 3 hours once a week. It's very depressing. Ola is in a prison with criminals, but it's interesting, a lot of people, even though you have some who are murderers, most of the people in the Ecuadorian jail and prison that I went to, they didn't pay bills, and they were there. There were fines, and it's interesting because I also served time in like a Ferguson jail during protests there, and equally in the United States, you see that poor people who cannot afford to pay fines, they're there. So you have Ola, and Ola is a very interesting case, again, because he didn't do anything wrong. For his first hearing that they had, the judge approved him to continue to be detained because the amount of USB drives that he had, the amount of computers that he had, and he had a lot of English books. We all have a lot of English books. Do we deserve to be detained in prison because of that? Ola specifically has English books talking about privacy, talking about threats on systems and how to attack systems. What he does for a living for many of years has been contributing to free software, open source tools. You have contributions such as Tor, which is an internet browser that conceals a user's location. Obviously, we have our famous Google that collects all of our data and information and can be used against us. And if it's not used against us for us to be criminalized, it's used against us for consumerism and targeted marketing and different things like that. So having a browser like Tor is very helpful. You have Let's Encrypt, another initiative to encrypt the entire internet that Ola has been a part of. Enigmail is a security add-on for Mozilla Thunderbird. It's another free software. So you have all these tools that Ola has contributed. He's not a hacker, he's a developer. developer, so he needs to know about all these things. This only adds to him being an expert in his field, but because he has access to these books and he has these books in his hand, he's seen as a criminal for that. Now it's really interesting for someone like me, where I met Ola in 2015. I met Ola after spending time in Ferguson during the Ferguson uprising, 2014, where Mike Brown was unarmed and killed, his teenage child baby, by a grown white man police officer who brutally killed him cold-blooded. And there were so many people who were protesting. Now it was interesting, I got to the scene around August 2014, but in addition of people like me who went to support, a lot of people didn't go to support. You had 200 FBI agents who also went down to Ferguson and spent a year in Ferguson. And what type of information were they gathering? Luckily for us, the Ferguson Police Department was not smart. So they would boast, oh, we were looking at your text messages, and we're like, wait, how are they looking at our text messages? They would leak information because they wanted to seem powerful. Their silly male egos wanted them to just kind of boast on the type of information they had, but what that really brought to me as a technologist was, because I was working as an IT consultant back then, that activists needed tech skills. Like, we needed to have this knowledge as well. So in 2015, I started a tech activist program for activists to learn tech training. Then I was advised to go to the Internet Freedom Festival that takes place in Spain, and to talk about the design and any feedback that people on the ground had with privacy tools. Because a lot of people who are creating tools, they don't really come from like poor people of color who don't really have access. They understand the need for privacy, but they don't understand accessibility and user experience. So I was talking a bit on that and met Ola. So he heard about me and he was like, he wanted to help share information on how local activists in Ferguson, local activists who are poor, black and brown, how can we better have the right type of knowledge to protect ourselves? So not only is Ola a technologist, but he is an activist. He's a movement techie who, yes, he gets paid to do this techie work, but he shares his knowledge with the movement so that we can protect ourselves and so we can continue the important work that we're doing. So it's really interesting and so sad to see that he's still detained. There's no one really bringing up what's happening in Ecuador. Ecuador judges are just, it's kind of, in the hearing, people are bringing up so much that, Ola, he hasn't committed a crime, but the Ecuadorian government is just so set on, well, he's guilty because he has this knowledge and this information. And as an educator myself who wants to give more people access to this knowledge and information, it's really sad to see that there's this war on knowledge happening. And as people of color, it's like we're already criminalized, and as poor people for being poor, for being black, for being brown, and now we can be further criminalized for the type of knowledge that we want to seek out. And that is a really shameful process, shameful for the Ecuadorian government, shameful for the people who are involved in trying to prosecute him. And definitely would love to hear more questions, feedback from anyone. But yeah, super passionate about this.
And do you want to let folks know how they can contribute and get involved with Ola's case? Yeah,
so there's a website called freeolabini.org. So Ola is spelled O-L-A, and Bini is B as in Bravo, I-N-I. So luckily, Ola has been sharing some letters, and we put these letters on there so you can hear about the experience that he's having. We also have a fund that we're raising for his legal fees. We also have tweets if you want to do a Twitter storm for the Ecuadorian Prime Minister. We have letters, solidarity letters, and campaigns to sign. And then here at the People's Forum, we're also going to do some a very intro to digital security workshop training for activists, because again, knowledge is not a crime. And we need more people standing up, not being fearful, because this is like a fearful tactic. They're picking on Ola again because he's not going to have too many supporters. He's someone who always plays the background. But he has helped hundreds, thousands of activists in Latin America, in poorer countries, and everywhere. He helps us. He's a movement technologist, and it's like we are not going to stay silent as they try to prosecute him, because he has not committed a crime. So we definitely want to like lift him up and lift up that sharing knowledge is not a crime. And although they're trying to scare people who teach other people about this knowledge, and about they're trying to shame and scare people who contribute to privacy enhancing tools, it's like we're not scared. If anything, this is only motivating us to continue the work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do folks have any questions or comments?
I'm just curious. Is Ola Bini a national of which country?
So he is from Sweden.
And
He
Sweden.
has a visa to live in Ecuador, and he's been living in Ecuador for the past 6 years. So his life, the person he's dating, his job, everything is in Ecuador.
Wow.
So now I was just curious about, maybe if the Swedish government cares, they could put pressure. I don't know if there are international laws that provide grounds for something like that to happen.
So last week, the parents of Ola Bini started talking to Swedish lawyers and more, just to gather more information again. When Ola was detained, he wasn't given a translator, no one was notified, and there was a lot of illegal things during his arrest that happened. So all of that is being brought to the surface.
You know, I think the Swedish government is talking to the Ecuadorian government about this. I mean, I think that I don't think they've gotten a lot. The only thing I saw was that they had asked for details on why he was arrested, and so you know, it doesn't seem like the details add up to a case
Right.
from what we know. But
Lots of English books.
yeah, exactly, right? So I think that I would guess that they're kind of working through diplomatic channels to find out what's going on, which is a different situation. You know, I think you're better off a Swedish citizen in Ecuador than an Australian sentence with a U.S. indictment in England, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
I mean, and frankly, you're better off in England though with a U.S. indictment than the U.S. But
Right.
but it is. I can't imagine these cases aren't related, right? Like,
No,
you know,
Right.
like Assange was under extradition to Sweden, right? And the whole point of the Assange extradition to Sweden was so that Sweden could extradite him to the U.S. was the fear. The Obama administration never really went through with that, and it seems like the Obama administration kind of backed off. They're like, it's too close to the line in terms of what to do. You know, Trump's blazing forward, even though he, you know, during his campaign, I think claimed that WikiLeaks was his best friend or something. But
correct.
but you know, and then now we have a Swedish citizen.
In
right?
Ecuador.
In Ecuador, I mean, luckily for him, the U.S. isn't after him, I don't think. So.
No, but this, it's still, we can laugh. And I know we're just being sarcastic. But sadly, they're trying to charge him with at least 5 years with, again, no charge.
Yeah, and I want to, I wouldn't be so shocked if the law that they came up with that is charging with that is based on some U.S. law, right? Like, because we export these things, right? So.
I appreciate that you point out political economy, which also talks about the hegemony of the United States in this region. And part of its hegemony is the copy and paste of laws and procedures that don't apply in any other country but the United States, but actually forcing it in different ways. And so looking into what you were saying in terms of like, you know, strategies that have the become also part of a military strategy of occupation and intervening. There was a speaker that came from Brazil talking about hybrid warfare, and cyber warfare is also part of that. And when we look at the case of Lula, is one aspect of it, but if we look at the case of Venezuela and the media blockage that happens in that sense is also like the control and the dominance over a region, utilizing different tactics to a larger strategy. And so I would say that even though Ola is not necessarily being connected to anything in the United States, it is the dominance of the United States in this region that has created that situation there.
No, I think that totally makes sense, right? I mean, it's a sign of, Ecuador's changing administration away from a pink-tide government,
Right.
and a very clear move towards, okay, we're going back to the empire, right?
Right.
Like,
And
this is our, we'll prove it.
right. And declaring themselves allies
Yeah.
of the United States. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I wanted to switch gears. So this event was framed around like how this sets a terrible precedent. Now, there's been a lot of talks about like how the Julian Assange case sets a terrible precedent for journalists, but also like, what do you think in terms of like how it sets a terrible precedent for movements and for organizers? I mean, we have Ola, who is not himself like a whistleblower or a hacker, or who got just caught in this crossfire, I guess to make a point, right? So can you share your thoughts on how you think this could set a terrible precedent for movements?
I mean, I guess I don't know. I'm not particularly concerned about the precedent. I mean, look, it's just one more like every time they break. So there's a lot of conversation, kind of mainstream media, about breaking of norms, right? And really what it is exertion of power, right? And so you might, and that's what this is. It's a further exertion of power, which, yes, it sets a precedent. It doesn't set a legal precedent necessarily, though it might set some legal precedents. But really what it does is it's ratcheting up it's ratcheting up the dynamic between raw exertion of power and this idea of the rule of law or something like that, right? And that's always in tension, right? And that's always the dynamic, right? And so I think, to me, what the lesson, I mean, the thing that it says to me the most is that we need a stronger and especially as in the United States, we need to start developing a better sense of internationalism, right? We need to start having ways of operating collectively across these borders, right? What I would want to see is we need to have the people in Sweden who are politically aligned with us, and the people in Ecuador who are politically aligned with us, and the people here who are politically aligned. If we can get to that point, then we're building counter-hegemonic power. We're building power, right? If we're caught in the realm of what is the national security state, what precedent are they setting? They're only going to be moving in one direction, right? And if we're only caught in their framework, then it's just how much worse can it get? And that's, we could, I think I probably did some of that in terms of what I was saying. But I think that frankly, the if we want to come out with a better analysis or with a better plan, it has to be in those terms of how do we get out of this, right? Because, the raw exertion of power is just going to exert power to its end, right? And they'll use a legalistic mechanism. They'll use, an international law, or they'll just run up a tank, right? They're going to do, as you said, right, I don't remember exactly the term, but it's kind of like multi-level warfare, right? And that's just, it's just the exertion of power, right? I mean, if you can't have a ground invasion, you can have a drone strike. If you can't have a drone strike, you can do a cyber attack. If you don't do a cyber attack, you do a media campaign. If you don't do a media campaign, you arrest a few activists and hackers or whatever, right? Like, you know, that really, it's like, okay, that is what they're going to do. We kind of know it. It's just like they're going to use whatever they can to, like, you know. And, but for us, I think really, it's like, well, how do we think through this? How do we think that are kind of, you know, one is like, what is our model of that, and how do we align politically here, right? Like, how do we disrupt these systems internally and externally and internationally, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything what you said, I think surveillance has been a tool used, that's been an international tool for a long time, starting with the enslavement of bodies from Africa, bringing them to Latin America, to the islands, for the sake of capitalism. People were given like numbers, and those numbers were surveilled, like how often are you working, how often are you getting sick. Surveillance has been a thing to control populations for so long. This is not anything new. The U.S. government specifically has a long and shameful history of using surveillance to disrupt and discredit movements, COINTELPRO specifically. So again, this is nothing new. What's new is the tools that's being used. What's new is how these tools are being marketed to us. Google Drive is marketed to us. All these very centralized, profit-driven corporations who have huge contracts with the government. Amazon specifically was like $3.1 billion contract for their cloud service. The same cloud service is being used to detain and keep information for ICE. And there's so much, like, the coalition between, or the marriage of, like, technology and state control and surveillance has been, it's a huge matrimony that we're seeing in our times. And it's like, it's important for us to continue to use and promote decentralized, open source, free software that's not going to collect our information, that doesn't want to track any of what we're putting out there, so that we can continue our work. So the surveillance talk is an international talk. Encryption is an international talk. And I know it's always scary. I feel like these things are set to be fearful, and I'm so tired of fearful conversations, you know? Because when we talk about tech, that's all we talk about. It's like, oh, they're watching everything, they can see everything, but we just need more people to continue to create. Because the more tools we're creating, you know, there's a lot of holes that we can even see with the amount of information that these tools are collecting. They have so much, they can't even data mine their own information. So it's like, so long as we can see the weaknesses and how they're creating these and using these tools, we should continue creating our people and giving them access and knowledge of creating these similar tools, but that's decentralized, open source, free software, so we can keep working.
Thank you.
No, I think that's totally right, and I would just add in, like, I mean, maybe what I'm going to say is controversial, but I think that, like, we have to start thinking seriously about how we, like, you know, if we think about the power of open source software, you know, like, you know, Linux is being the preeminent example, right? Linux has huge contributor bases from the corporate sector, right? And, like, I think that we also, as, like, more people, like, kind of left aligned are gaining more and more state power, like, we need to get out of this contracting privatized model. We can actually leverage state power to build and strengthen open source projects and use that. I remember the government of India at some point was going to all open source, you know, government computing, right? But, like, there's no reason that we have to pay tax dollars to Amazon, right? Like, you know, and the controversial part is that maybe, I know that people, there's a narrative that Tor, for example, is funded by the State Department, and therefore, but for me it's about if they're funding an open source project that we can audit, that we can look at the code, and that we can deploy like outside of government infrastructure, right? That to me is a net win. And like, so how can we further that kind of thinking at municipal levels, at other levels where, you know, I would hate to, I don't want to see like, you know, if we have, you know, like socialists taking office and they're using state money to go to Amazon, right?
Right.
So like, I think we need to broaden our concept, because I think largely in the kind of activist techie world, we're like, we just need to do this. We have 65 hours collectively is the problem, right? And we don't have the development time and resources to make all the things that we need. And like, I think we need to expand our concept of how we can build that kind of critical, decentralized, open source infrastructure that's not just like the same 35 coders and like not getting paid to do something.
Right. Great. Are there any final comments or questions?
I wanted to know more about what you do and what are the like practical things that your organization does, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, techactivist.org was created, like I said, it was created because it was inspired by the people of Ferguson. At the time, I was asked to go to Ferguson to help with web development so that we, the people on the ground, so I'm including myself, in the struggle of Ferguson, can really take back what the media conversations, media narratives was. And it was interesting as I was working on this, and it was a project that I was able to work on for 3 weeks. So many of the activists was like, oh, I want to learn how to code. Oh, I want to learn how to do this. Oh, I want to learn how to do that. And it's like, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we given the opportunity? As someone who, I mean, I'm from the Badlands, North Philly, I always proudly represent that 75% dropout rate in my high school. I graduated barely knowing how to read, write, do math, or any of that. But luckily, I got my hand on a laptop and was able to grasp so much information. And what I was embarrassed to, I used to be embarrassed to say, oh, I don't know that in front of people. I would say it, some people would laugh at me, they would make jokes. When you go to the internet, yeah, right now you have a lot of like white supremacist people like hacking people and doing a lot of bad stuff, but the internet at that time, it was a really amazing space where they would share information. They're like, oh, you don't know how to do this? Here's this link, here's this tutorial, here's that. So since I was like 18, started pulling a lot of information from the web, learning lots where I went to college not even knowing what a number line was. I ended up graduating with 3.86 in applied statistics, started a tutoring program at my school for other people to learn statistics, applied statistics. Then I went to Silicon Valley, partnered with Kimberly Bryant to start working with her on Black Girls Code, teaching young girls of color computer programming. Then got hired as an IT consultant, working with social justice organizations and teaching them about just basic concepts of tech. And then Ferguson happened, and I was just like, fuck all this corporate shit. Like, I want to just be with the people, educating our people on technology, on information that we should have access to. So that's kind of what techactivist.org, we teach very basically, you come as is, and we try to show you like basically a skeleton of information that you should be aware of. And it's a learning space. Right now we are fundraising to have like 3D printers to try to see here at the People's Forum. If you have a 3D printer that uses like recyclable plastics, you get young people to put in recyclable plastics that we see here in the street every day. And then what can we recreate with that? So to me, I'm hoping that we recreate hope on what we're able to do. I think for so many years since I've been alive, Silicon Valley and corporations have have dictated what innovation is, what revolutionary innovation and what is possible. I don't think that is true, because what I've been able to create has been far more revolutionary than what I see any of these MIT folks creating. They're not creating anything for the poor, they're creating everything for profit. So to me, to see young people here in New York or in any city who are battling gentrification and homelessness, give them access to understand how a 3D printer works, and then see what they create with that. How would they look at an empty lot? Do not wait for Silicon Valley or a foundation to do something, but they can themselves create something for, like, to, with this empty lot. So that is just like one aspect, is like imagination and hope. The other aspect that we really focus on is digital security tools, is trying to get people to use decentralized tools as people of color. It's really interesting. We have, I would say most of my workshops I have open for like 10 or 15 people is what ideally I would like to have in the room. But people in here can say, when I have these workshops, 80 people show up. People are super hungry. You see from 16 to 25-year-olds, and then you see 45 to 80-year-olds. And it's really interesting to see the older crowd, because they're just like, hey, we're getting hacked, people are spamming us, people are doing all this stuff, and we want to learn how to protect ourselves, and we're not being brought in the conversation. They do feel it's a safe space to come in and to learn information. Also, we see a lot of technologists coming in and saying, hey, we want to understand what the struggle is. So a lot of what techactivists.org does, with thanks to the Popular Education Project, is bring political education, popular education, to understand like the root to systemic oppression, how, like, why is there poverty, who are the poor, why are we poor. So not only are we learning how to create these tools, but you're learning about why is this system in place, so you can have a better understanding of what problem you're trying to solve. Because oftentimes you have people creating something, but it's like, what is this? If you don't understand the problem, how are you bringing solutions to the table? You need to understand the problem. So it's just having techies step back and really just understand different problems that people are up against. So it's a very small grassroots organization, but luckily we've been able to partner with a lot of cool individual community people who donate like $5, $1. Every workshop that we've had has been sponsored by the people who attend the workshop. So I have a donation button and I say, hey, we're going to do this workshop. And the people who attend it fundraises about like $300. So we're able to have food. We bring in experts, technical experts. We bring in OGs from like the Black Panther movement to really talk about like what was surveillance like in their day, and if they had today's tools, what would they have done? So it's just really interesting to have that knowledge sharing with like elders and different folks.
And Idalene is also hosting a workshop here on digital security, and it's going to happen on June 8th from 11 to 2. You can find more info on our website, peoplesforum.org.
When you were saying, I'm just curious, I'm not very knowledgeable about these things, but do you know of any antecedent of using information from Google, for example, and against a person innocent?
Yeah, I mean, everything you search on Google can be used against you.
In which it has been used?
Well, maybe the lawyer.
I know I've heard for a fact Google will give all of your search information. If there's any case against you, Google will give it.
I mean, it's there's lots. I mean, your specific question is about Google, or
In
is it about
general,
Facebook is worse.
Facebook is worse than
Right?
Google.
Yeah, Google. I mean, look, they have all. The question is this: they have a ton of information, right? Google specifically has a ton of information, right? they don't just, unlike Facebook, they don't just give it to the cops always. They, a lot of times, but if they want to charge you with a crime and get a search warrant, they have to give it to you. They have it. And them having it is the bigger problem than how they get it. Because at the end of the day, you know, the problem that we have in terms of digital surveillance is not just the innocent person being charged. Like, we have the whole system is just, there's too many people being charged, right? Like, especially in terms of, you know, it's still, despite all the stuff we talked about today, mostly they're putting people in jail for drugs, right? Like, that's what it is, right? And like, that's gotta end. But what all this stuff does is it makes it much easier, right? And it makes it, you know, one of the things that you'll see a lot is, because a lot of the cases are conspiracy cases, and we don't have time to go into all the depths of that. But the point is, what's happening with this kind of data is people are being labeled. Because generally, if you're just a normal person, right, you have certain rights, and they can only, you know, they can only put you in jail, or, you know, they can only violate those rights if you've, you know, they have certain types of evidence against you. But broadly, what we see is carving out categories of people that you can take their rights away, that they can make it easier to put your, so the biggest one is gangs, right? Everyone's got to watch that Killer Mike. Has there people seen the Killer Mike thing with the Bloods and Crips? Please watch that. Like, this, I've been screaming this forever. Like, most of what Bloods and the Crips do is hang out together, right? But if you're labeled a Blood or a Crip and you're charged with a crime, all of a sudden it doesn't really matter what happened because you're guilty, right? Because you've gotten this label. Likewise, you know, there's a no-fly list, right? That's just a list of people that someone somewhere has said something that until very recently you couldn't even find out if you were on it, you couldn't challenge it, there's nothing, you know, terrorism is another one. I mentioned the case of the animal rights activists labeled as terrorists, right? Like, it's like, if you're labeled a terrorist, all of a sudden, it doesn't really matter what you did, right? Like, and so, this is the dynamic, right? Like, when you have all this data about people, you can just pick little bits out. So, like, you'll see a lot of cases where it's like, oh, you were on a YouTube video with this rapper, so, you know, which is just a kid in his neighborhood making a YouTube video. But it's like, he's talking about doing crimes. Now you're in the video with him, YouTube, you know, and this isn't even something that they have to get a warrant or anything. It's just there, right? So they're saying, okay, you know, now you're a gang associate, right? How many times have you heard this kind of language? Terrorist affiliated, gang associated, linked to, right? Because the more data you have, the more links you have to everything. So they could just say, you know, he's linked to this and he's linked to this, and that's what this kind of, you know, and we don't have the kind of society where people are just incredibly skeptical of the government, right? People believe what the government says. So, you know, they say terrorist linked and in front of a jury, no, you're done, right?
I mean, I would even take it even more personal, just like while in Ferguson, I would say even up until maybe last year, I was still fighting a case that the Ferguson Police Department had on me that said I was assaulting a police officer. Now in 2018, a bill was passed, the Blue Lives Matter bill, that anyone who is given a charge of assaulting a police officer is going to be sentenced with a 10-year imprisonment. Now what's interesting and important about that case that I was involved with is a couple of my students in Ferguson was out of the classroom, called me saying, hey, Eveline, there's these police officers who are arresting us, they're bothering us, they were intense. So I went outside and they were like, can you record all of this? I went outside with a camera to record. My main intention is to record this illegal action because the students have every right to be outside protesting the encampment that they set up. The police officer felt attacked by me recording and went to grab my phone. I went back because I was like, I have every right. Of course we know we have no rights when it comes to what they say versus what we say. one of the police officers grabbed my arm, the other one grabbed my other arm, and you could see in camera, because then someone else is recording, that I am holding my arms together because I'm like, I am not going to be arrested. You have no right to arrest me. I'm recording you. I have every right to record you. During that arrest, because they did arrest me, they put me in a car for 2 hours because I wanted to speak to a lawyer. They did not allow me to speak to a lawyer. They said I lost all my rights whenever I raised my voice to them. They gave me 7 different charges. One of them was assaulting a police officer. Did I have money to cover all these charges? No, that was 2.5 years of going to court to fight this off. And what information could they prove and pull together was my social media on me talking about all the police reportings of police brutality to show that I have hate for police, to show and paint me in this way. But interesting enough, because as you said, everyone wants this empathetic person. So I'm very empathetic. Everyone's like, what? She's like this teacher. She educates people. She helped create Black Girls Code. She did so much. So then the courtroom was like, okay, well, we can't go too hard on her because there's a lot of people who have a lot of empathy for her who's going to speak up. But how many times will that continue to happen?
Right.
Where young, innocent people who did not do anything to a police officer will be given this charge and be faced with 10 years in prison, and then social media, Google searches, all of that would then be used to create this story of why they hate the police, instead of talking about
What actually
police
happened.
brutality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because the problem is, right, the problem is once you are in that system, right, the narrative is already established that you did something wrong, right?
Yes.
And then the way that the social media works and the way that all that data collection works is they get, the government gets to kind of pick exactly what they want to fill their narrative.
Mhm.
And then when you try to counter it, the rules generally don't let you do that, is the problem, right? If you were in court, you probably experienced that where you're like, look at the thing I said after, and then the judge is like, no, you know? And so, you know, because the narrative is already established, that it's like you did something, and then there's a kind of fundamental problem in our judicial system where you run a very big risk to testify. For you to go up and tell your story and tell you what happened, it runs a very big risk, especially if you've ever been arrested for anything else in the past, right? Which is the case for a lot of people. And so a lot of people just, you know, looking at the odds, just, you know, okay, I'll take the 1 year or whatever, you know?
So I did
rather
2-year probation. They made
Yeah.
me file. They dropped some of the charges. They made me file 2-year guilty for littering. And I had to pay a fine and then do 2 years probation. And if I'm ever caught at a protest, then they bring back all the charges. But again, something like this is also happening with Ola, where it's like he's innocent, but they're pulling information to make him sound guilty. And that is the risk that we see when using these corporate, private, centralized tools, and that's why we need more open source free software.
So you don't use social media anymore for, I don't know, political messages?
I was there for a couple years. I didn't use social media for a lot because also just being in Ferguson, a lot of undercover FBI agents he know newspapers were still corrupt? Yes, but he used media of his time, and we today can't allow fear to silence us. We need to use media of our time. It's not going to be the only type of organizing that's going to get us free, but there's billions of people on Facebook. We need to be on Facebook to kind of shake up the media, the narrative, the ideology that's put there, and then keep organizing offline, or with decentralized, open source, free software tools.
Great. If there's no more questions, are there any questions, comments? So I think we can close. Thank you so much for coming and joining this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, thank you.
Do you need to stop the thing? How does that work?
Yes, I'm gonna go.
Perfect timing. You're late.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That's also wearing that mask.
In Ferguson?
Yeah,
Nice.
he was working with Blue Peak.
Oh yeah.
Oh, and then he quit that, right?
Yeah.
Ah, that's crazy. He's a colored pink.
Oh, pink.
Are you friends with, did you know Daruba?